Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. All right, this is an incredible crowd. I'm happy to see all of you out here. I think what we need to do is, with this lecture series every year, is we just put spy in the title, you know, like New Mexico statehood and the spies, and you know, the spies of the Spanish period. But thank you all. For those of you who don't know, my name is Daniel Goodman, and I'm the museum director of El Rancho de los Golondrinas Living History Museum. Welcome to the 2023 Speaking of Traditions lecture series. Las Golondrinas has been putting on this series since 1999, making this the 25th year, and we're happy to be partners with the New Mexico Museum of Art and what I think is the premier venue here in Santa Fe, the St. Francis Auditorium. Yeah. At this time, please be sure to silence your cell phones, including everybody up in the balcony. Any phone that does go off, we're going to collect. We're going to give to Alan. He's going to take them to the lab, give them to the engineers, and they're going to use them for target practice. And at the end of this lecture, we are on a tight, we do have to be out of here by 7. So once the lecture's over, if you'll please go out to the lobby, and if you have additional questions for Alan, he'll go ahead and address them out there. This is a talk that he's compressed for the time frame that we have here, so bear with us. Everyone can support both Golondrinas and the Art Museum by becoming members. It makes a huge difference. And you can either go online to do that, or we're happy to take care of that for you out in the lobby on your way out. For those of you who are watching this broadcast later on the Golondrinas live sessions, just post your questions in the comments section and they will be answered. Be sure to check out our website for details of our upcoming festival season. We have our spring festival, which is going to be June 3rd and 4th. That festival is going to feature the unveiling of Las Golondrinas' National Historic Register plaque. We were nominated to the National Register in 2022. And also a collaboration program with SWAYA, details to come, so stay tuned for that. It's going to be really, really cool. Also be sure to check out nmartmuseum.org. The Art Museum has some incredible pieces on exhibit, also a glass show, and an exhibit on northern New Mexico wood carvers as well. So please come back and support the New Mexico Museum of Art. Tonight we have Alan Carr presenting on Manhattan Project Spies. It actually almost didn't happen. In keeping with tonight's topic, earlier today, Alan and his PowerPoint were stolen and provided to the Friends of History at the Palace of the Governors just across the street. We had some high-level negotiations. We were able to get him back, but we had to exchange historian Tomas Chavez and the manuscript for his upcoming book on Benjamin Franklin in Spain. So we're happy everything worked out. I can assure you that story is not true. But please be sure to check out the lecture series of the Friends of History over at the Palace of the Governors as well. So, Alan Carr currently serves as a program manager and the senior historian for Los Alamos National Laboratory. During his tenure as a lab historian, which began in 2003, Alan has produced several publications and lectures pertaining to the Manhattan Project, nuclear testing, and the history evolution of Lanel. He has lectured for numerous professional organizations and has been featured as a guest on many local, national, and international radio and television programs. Before coming to Los Alamos, Carr completed his graduate studies at Texas Tech University. This evening, Alan is speaking on Manhattan Project Spies. During the Manhattan Project, 4 Los Alamos insiders stole secret information and provided it to the Soviet Union. This is the story of their treachery, what they stole, why they committed espionage, and what happened to them. I'm excited to welcome Mr. Alan Carr.
Dan actually threatened me physically if I didn't finish on time. Pretty much, that's what I saw. Thank you for being here. I wasn't expecting so many people. Thank you for being here, for supporting Los Golondrinas. I mean, this is awesome. Wonderful to be here with you in Santa Fe. And so yes, I've been at the laboratory about 20 years now, and so I'm going to ask you the obvious, but who pays my salary? The lab pays my salary, right? I'm an American, if you're wondering about that. I went to, actually it's the Texas Tech University, is what we prefer. So, you know, it is a compressed talk. Usually I like to take about 90 minutes. We're going to, you know, it's supposed to last 90 minutes and last 2 hours. Dan has told me it will last 50 minutes tonight. So I'm going to cram in as much as I can for you tonight. And so there are a lot of perspectives on this history. Okay, you're going to get a compressed version of like my perspective on it. So go out and look and see what's out there. I'm going to try and point you to some different sources so that you can hear some different voices on this topic as well. And also, so you heard my credentials, right? So you should also know my lack of credentials here. So I am the laboratory historian. And so Los Alamos, the laboratory has been there for 80 years. This is our 80th anniversary at the laboratory. That's a lot of history for a historian to take on. So I do history in a lot of areas over the entire history of the laboratory. This is one little piece. There are specialists in this area. I'm going to introduce you to a couple of them during the talk. In fact, I think one is in the room to correct me tonight. I hope he was able to get a ticket. My friend John Earl Haynes, who I've not been able to see lately, hopefully he's here. But I do want to point you to the real scholarship on this topic. So tonight you'll get a little bit of the Los Alamos perspective. We're going to run through our history very quickly here. Now who are my New Yorkers? Okay. Oh, there's a lot of you here. There's a lot of you. Okay, so we're going to have a little bit of fun at your expense. Although it would appear I'm outnumbered, so I may have to be nice tonight. You'll see why we call this the New York, I Love New York edition tonight. So the first thing I want you to think about, because I should tell you, actually many years ago when this talk was originally commissioned, it was commissioned by our security folks up at the laboratory. Because this is kind of, at least in the laboratory's history, the original insider threat. They were curious, and so I put this together with them as my audience. A little of that has kind of translated over. We're going to have a little bit of fun, but this is kind of serious business. It's not just a spy story. These things actually happened, and there were real consequences to them. But fun first, right? So here's your next question of the night. Who's your favorite spy? Who's your favorite, like, Hollywood spy, right? So if you're struggling to think of it, I've put some selections up here. Any fans? Go ahead, say it. I know it's a big room, but you can speak up if you want. We're all friends now, right? So anyway, my favorite for tonight's lecture, at least, is, what's his name? Ethan Hawke? Or Hunt? Did I get it right? Okay, thank you. I don't watch enough TV. But anyway, see how he's there in Mission Impossible? He's dangling from the ceiling and things like that. That's actually generally not how they do it. But it looks really good on movies. And so I would say that, number one, if you're thinking, you know, I'd kind of like to be a spy, and we're going to assume that you're going to spy for your country, right, instead of against it for tonight, the first thing that I'm going to advise you to do is, like, not dangle from ceilings. That could be suspicious. Okay? And also, if you show up in, like, a tuxedo carrying a submachine gun, that could give away that there's a potential threat in the area, okay? So as you can see, Hollywood spies they kind of stand out, don't they? So tonight, during most of the talk, you will get to pretend to be a security investigator for the Manhattan Project. Sound like fun? But you've got a tough job. So this is serious business. We'll look at the background really super quickly tonight in another slide or two. But here, investigators, all of you who have signed up, now, these are badge photos, we call them badge photos, of people who worked at the laboratory during World War II. Who do you think's the spy? Somebody, I heard it, Betty Lou. Every time I have given this talk, whichever version, somebody always says, it's Betty Lou. And then I ask them, why do you think it's Betty Lou? And usually I get some variation of, well she looks so innocent, there's no way she could be a spy, therefore. It's gotta be her. So I don't want anyone to throw anything, yet at least. We'll see if I deserve it later. In fact, none of those people are known spies. that you see on the screen. These are all loyal, patriotic, hardworking. Project Y is the code name for Los Alamos, were employees back during the war. But what does a good spy do? Blend in, right? Leave the submachine gun and tuxedo at home, right? Just get a flannel shirt, show up for work, talk around the cooler, and do things like that. So that's your first pro tip of the day. And unless you're spying against your country, then you don't remember any of this. So to transition a little bit to more serious business as we do this. This is not a talk about the whole Manhattan Project. We don't have a lot of time for that. Again, during Q&A and when I stick around, I am going to stick around out in the lobby when we're done. You can ask me whatever you want about these things. We're going to go through some pretty serious history in like a minute. But I think everybody here knows the basic story of the Manhattan Project. The initial threat that we're really concerned with is that it really looks like Nazi Germany could have a nuclear weapon soon. Okay, they had all the basic ingredients that you would need, and that's one of the early drivers of the Manhattan Project. There's a lot more to that story, but for tonight's talk at least, do imagine for just a moment a world in which Adolf Hitler has a nuclear monopoly. Because in the mid-40s, that looked like, or mid-early 40s, that looked like a possibility, okay? And so, of course, the Manhattan Project is eventually set up in the summer of 1942 in August to build a nuclear weapon, to build nuclear weapons as quickly as possible in this perceived race with Nazi Germany, okay? So that's why we're set up. Of course, the Manhattan Project was a huge national project that employed hundreds of thousands of people at one point or another during its existence at installations all over the country. Los Alamos is the weapons design laboratory. So the job at Los Alamos is to design, build, test, and help deliver these weapons in combat. So that is the mission up on the Hill, as it was known back then and remains to this day. Of course, Robert Oppenheimer is the director of the laboratory. If you want to know more about Dr. Oppenheimer, you can go to Wikipedia. Good information, good, reliable source there with that Wikipedia. They're making a movie, too. So there you go. They'll save you the trouble of reading a book. So that is coming out this summer. Be on the lookout for that. I know I am. I think there's a lot of events coming up. But anyway, Oppenheimer was an incredible scientist, kind of an unlikely pick to be the director of Los Alamos, but really turned out to be an inspired choice. And so, as I mentioned, this is our 80th anniversary. Our first major technical conference happened in April of 1943. It's about to be April of 2023 now. In roughly 27, 28 months, two entirely different types of nuclear weapons were successfully developed at Los Alamos, using different materials and different mechanisms of assembly. That's pretty remarkable when you think about it, but again, a talk for a different day. The more complex of the two was called an implosion bomb, an imploding bomb. It used plutonium, and it was tested at full scale, not too far from here, down in what is today known as the White Sands Missile Range. Back then, it was the Alamogordo bombing range. This was the Trinity test. Oppenheimer gave it its name. You can see the picture there from photographer Jack Abbey, who was one of Nobel laureate Emilio Segre's technicians. That's the good photo that we have from Jack up there. And when this went off, it released the equivalent of 21,000 tons of TNT. And you could rapidly reproduce them and drop them out of a plane. So this was a remarkable new weapon. Now, I do give talks just on the Manhattan Project. I have a 2-hour talk just on Trinity and go into things like fallout and all that fun stuff. So we could do that a different night, because I know many of you probably have questions about those topics. And again, I am just one perspective on that. But if you have questions about that, I will stick around when we're done. Another lecture that I give is on the atomic bombings. Even talking about spies in the Manhattan Project, I just don't feel comfortable talking really about any Manhattan Project topic without at least mentioning the use of these weapons in combat. Okay, so we have the strikes against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Nazi Germany had been defeated a couple of months before the Trinity test was conducted. Okay, so again, 90 minutes to talk about that, a different night. So I don't want to dodge the topic, because this was, these attacks were some of the most significant events, I would say, in human history. And it's important to remember what an atomic bomb will do. But we are going to talk about espionage in just a moment. This slide makes it sound as simple as we dropped an atomic bomb, we dropped another atomic bomb, and Japan surrendered. It's a lot more complex than that, okay? My personal view is that atomic bombs did play an important role, but a non-exclusive role in bringing the Japanese to the surrender table, okay? And again, you can ask me about that, especially if we stick around during the hall. But as we leave that, at least for tonight, let's adjust our minds back to talking about espionage. So we're going to get the spies, and like Dan mentioned, you put spies on anything and you can immediately sell it. My house is for sale. I'll just put Spies on it. I've got a car for sale, spy car. And all of a sudden, people are filling up the room by the hundreds, right? It is fascinating history, I think, and we'll see if you agree as we go through. And of course, John Earl Haynes, I think, is somewhere in the room. He will make notes of what I got wrong and what I need to elaborate on. 4 known spies, 4 identified spies at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project. Brief introductions for each of them as we begin. So our first is Ted Hall, and you'll note that he was born October 20th, 1925 in New York City. Now, remember, 1943, the laboratory sets up shop, and he gets there in 1944. He's still a teenager, and he's already completed his work at Harvard. He already has an undergraduate degree at Harvard. He's working at Los Alamos, so he's a pretty bright guy. So he gets there early in the year, in 1944, and he works in the physics division. So originally at Los Alamos, there were 4 technical divisions. One of them was physics. Now, Oppenheimer reorganized the laboratory in August of 1944 to build an imploding bomb, okay? You'll note that, remember, the war ends 1 year later. 1 year later, almost to the day after that reorganization. So things happened extremely quickly at the laboratory back then. He works in the physics division. As part of the reorganization, a new division, the Gadget Division, G Division, more formally known as the Weapons Physics Division, is created. And so that's where Ted Hall is doing his work. Now, he's a young guy. He's 19, 20 years old. He's very young, but he does have a degree. He's very bright, and he's working in the Weapons Physics Division. Do you think he will come in contact with sensitive information there? Yeah, not just come in contact with it, but several of our spies are, they're developing the information. It's not just that they're stealing other people's work, but these are things that they are working on and making valuable contributions to the work of Los Alamos at the time. Now, remember, you're all, I guess, deputized, however we do this, security officials. We're going to try and find some common threads. What are some ways that we can try and identify the insider threat here in the United States? I kind of like living in the U.S., don't you, where we're supposed to have rights. We can't just take somebody else and shoot them because we think that we're a spy. So we have to balance security with our rights as being Americans, okay? So that makes your job more difficult. Suspicion alone is not going to cut it. Well, anyway, you can see a pretty strong hint on the screen, if you've read it already, of why he committed espionage. Was he coerced? There's no hint of that. Was he bribed? There's no evidence of that. He voluntarily shares classified information with the Communist Party of America in October of 1944. Why would he volunteer? We'll come back to and talk about their motivations in just a little while, but if he volunteered, he probably thinks it should be done. By the way, didn't point it out, but remember, we're in a war with the Axis powers. The main countries of the Axis power, of course, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. None of these spies are helping them. They're all going to be helping the Soviet Union. Now, we were allies with the Soviet Union in the second half of World War II. We didn't really like them, and by we, I mean the countries of the West did not like the Soviet Union before the war started. I think the United States did not diplomatically recognize the Soviet Union until 1933, the same year Hitler came to power. So we didn't really like or trust them before the war or after the war, as it turns out, with the Cold War. But during the war, we had that great adhesive that brings people together, Adolf Hitler. We have this common cause to destroy Nazi Germany, okay? And so anyway, these spies that we're going to be talking about tonight are all helping the Soviet Union. The Soviets were not part of the Manhattan Project. And for, again, a couple of reasons. We don't really like them, we don't really trust them, and we don't really need them either. Now, we're going to talk about the Soviet program very quickly in just a little while, but we want to keep things going tonight. Now, imagine this for a moment. Now, I want you to pretend, this may be hard for some of you, I want you to pretend to be NKVD agents. Does everybody know what the NKVD is? How about the KGB? So they become the KGB. So you're now working for the Soviet Secret Service. A teenager shows up and says, I have a lot of information on a secret bomb I want to share with you. What would you be thinking? Well, boy, is this amateur hour or what? The Americans must be messing with us. I don't know how that translates in Russian, but I'm sure that's what they said. The Americans are messing with us. Or is this the luckiest day ever? It turns out that it's the luckiest day ever. Now, another hint that I'm going to give you as you help our country as a spy is I would recommend that, well, here's the question. What code name would you give yourself if you were a spy? I hope it's something pretty cool, right? You know, come up with a pretty, here's the hint. As you think, what would my code name be? I would not give yourself a code name that gives away your identity. Fair enough? We are going to see that happen a couple of times tonight. Well, anyway, they recognize that Ted Hall is, in fact, a true and important asset. He gets the code name Milad, which roughly translates to youth, young, the youngster. So let's call the teenage spy the youngster. That'll throw him off, right? And so anyway, that is Ted Hall, who you've just met very quickly. Now we talk about the brilliant. I call him the brilliant ingrate. Again, I'm biased, and I've told you that, so it's fair for me to share that. Well, anyway, look for common threads here. Are there any? So our next spy is Klaus Fuchs. That is the pronunciation, I believe. We will not be accepting any others tonight. So Klaus was born a generation earlier in Germany. Oh, okay, he's quite a bit different, at least in those demographics. Now, he is a member of the Communist Party, which will be another pretty strong hint of why he's spying to help the Soviet Union. Now, the Nazis didn't like a lot of people, did they? Yeah, they murdered like 6 million Jews, and then another 6 million people who they just didn't like. And guess who a lot of them were? Communists, ultimately. Okay? So anyway, Klaus Fuchs, Hitler is appointed chancellor in 1933. It's already been a bad place if you're a communist. Fuchs was actually assaulted. I think that he had a couple of teeth knocked out and was left for dead by Nazis at one point in his life. He leaves, and he goes to the UK, and this is where the ingrate business will come in. Now, let's say that you've been beaten up. You're basically, you need to find a new country. A new country welcomes you in. Would you be grateful for that country? Probably so, right? Let's say that country gave you an education. You could do your PhD there. Would you be grateful? Probably so, right? Now the war starts. Now Fuchs is a German citizen in the UK. So what happens to him? He goes to a detention center. I believe that he was in Canada and then on the Isle of Man for a while, which was pretty common practice. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention the detention center that was near Santa Fe for Japanese citizens, but also Japanese Americans who were deprived of their civil rights as well. So not exactly our finest hour in this part of the country. But anyway, Fuchs is put into a detention center as a German citizen. Anyway, his mentor, basically his mentor, almost a father figure, Rudolf Peierls, the German physicist and future group leader at the laboratory, he able to pull some strings, get Fuchs released from prison in the war, even though he's a German, and they bring him into the British nuclear weapons program. They give him a job, and they make him a British subject. So think about that for a moment. The UK has welcomed him in, given him an education, given him a job, and made him a British subject, even though he's a German, in the middle of World War II. Not a bad deal. How would you repay your British friends? Well, he repays them by stealing information from their program, which was well ahead of the American program at that point in time, and giving it to Soviet contacts. Okay, so anyway, he is going to get the code name Charles, which I believe is roughly the equivalent of the German name Klaus. yeah, oh, we did it again. We'll get to some cooler code names in a minute, so just bear with me if we will. I really should watch the time because Dan is looking menacing down there on the first row. But anyway, the British, as I mentioned, were well ahead of the United States in the first half of World War II on nuclear weapons. Actually, what helped us get into the Manhattan Project, to create the Manhattan Project, was help from the British to understand that nuclear weapons were, in fact, a feasible technology, and they were just a couple of years away. You Americans might want to jump into the war and prevent Hitler from having a nuclear monopoly. That really spurs the Manhattan Project into existence several months after that. That, too, is a lecture for another night if you're interested in British contributions. But anyway, again, Fuchs volunteered to spy. And, what's our common thread so far that's pretty obvious? Ideology, right? They're motivated by ideology. They're maybe true believers to one extent or another. I should mention before we leave Klaus Fuchs, there is a lot to say here, but not in a fast talk tonight. But Fuchs was not just some run-of-the-mill spy. Now, he wasn't a spy. He had no training. But what he did have was an incredible perspective of the Manhattan Project. He had worked at Oak Ridge before he came to Los Alamos. He was very familiar with the enrichment uranium, or the process for enriching uranium. When he came to Los Alamos, he was in the theoretical design division, so he was very familiar with some of the most sensitive technologies that were being developed for the atomic weapons during World War II. And not just that, he was a manager. So he was the equivalent of what we would today call a team leader. His boss was Rudolf Peierls. So he can get into any meeting. He's not a teenager. This is a senior theoretical physicist with a PhD. He can go anywhere he wants, get anything he wants. A lot of the information that he is taking out of the laboratory and passing on to his courier are things that he is developing himself. Okay? If he had not committed espionage, he probably would have been known rather as one of the preeminent scientists that we had in the theoretical division at that point in time. Okay? So anyway, that is our brilliant ingrate. That's my take on it. You might have a different one as well for yourself. So let's talk about David Greenglass. Has anybody heard of David Greenglass before? Maybe you have. So we have a few here. You're about to hear a little bit more about him. Let's see. March 2nd, 1922. So he's a young guy from New York City. I'm sure it's a coincidence. Anyway, during 1943, remember, it's almost a mainstream thing to be a member of the Communist Party or be interested in communism back in the 30s during the Great Depression. I mean, if you don't know where your next meal is coming from or your kids or grandchild's, would you consider doing things a different way? Probably, and a lot of people did during the 1930s. Well, then Stalin helps Hitler start World War II. So the Germans invade Poland, the Soviet Union invades Poland 17 days later. The Poles haven't forgotten that, by the way. But anyway, as we go on, once Hitler stabs Stalin in the back and invades the Soviet Union, we're all friends. And it's a cool thing to join what is it here, the Young Communist League. We can do that. So what does that tell you about Greenglass? Again, he's not coerced, he's not being bribed, he's interested, at the very least, in communist ideology. Okay, so he joins the youth club there, looks like fun. Well, anyway, you can, if you don't know David Greenglass, I bet that you do know his sister. His sister was Ethel Rosenberg, so you've all probably heard of the Rosenbergs before. So Ethel Rosenberg is his sister, making Julius Rosenberg his brother-in-law. That's going to come into play when we get a little bit further into the story. Well, anyway, he is assigned to the Manhattan Project. Initially, he is at Oak Ridge as well. You're going to see that 3 of our 4 spies do come to Los Alamos by way of Oak Ridge, where they're enriching uranium, just as a reminder. And so anyway, he is not a brilliant young theoretical physicist, but he does have a very important job. He's a machinist. And so he joins the Army. Well, do you have any classes in electrical engineering or physics, all this stuff? Are you a machinist? He's a machinist. Because here's the thing. The most common job on the Manhattan Project was construction worker. But then we forget about all these other jobs as well that made the development of nuclear weapons possible. One of them were machinists. How do you actually make something? You can't build a nuclear weapon on a chalkboard, so you better have some machinists around and many other people who can do technical work as well. So he has some machinist skills. He's brought into the Army. The Army makes him a part of what's called the Special Engineer Detachment, and the detachment that he's in ultimately arrives at Los Alamos. He is in X Division. So the original X Division at Los Alamos, the X stood for explosives, because you're going to need a lot of explosives to make an imploding nuclear weapon work. So the imploding bomb was made out of a lot of high explosives that had to be shaped in a certain way to maximize the amount of shock on the plutonium at the center of the weapon. Well, how do you make big, giant shaped charges? Well, you melt high explosive in a candy kettle, and then you pour it into a mold shaped like the shape that you want. Well, who's going to make the mold? Turns out it was David Greenglass, was one of the people who made the molds to cast the high explosive. So he doesn't have the same view as somebody like Klaus Fuchs, but he does have an important and complementary view of part of the project, just like Ted Hall. Maybe not as important as Ted Hall's work, but still, all of these guys kind of have a different view of the project, okay? And so anyway, that is what he's doing. And finally, a cool nickname, a cool spy name. What's his name? Caliber. That sounds pretty neat, right? By the way, did anyone come up with a spy name for yourself? Yeah. Well, you can discuss later. I'm curious to see if you come up with something. But anyway, he's Caliber. Now, he is considered a semi-skilled technician 4th class in X4 as a soldier. Technicians that was actually an Army rank back during World War II and for a few years after that. So anyway, the lower the number, the higher the rank. So I believe it went to like technician 5th class. He's a technician 4th class, semi-skilled with a semi-decent view of the project. We can talk about specific security later. How would somebody like Greenglass get to more sensitive information than he would otherwise have access to. If you have that question, we can talk about it if we have time in just a little while. But anyway, it is, I have on there, I kind of downplay it. It is not particularly useful. Maybe that's kind of my bias when you have somebody like Klaus Fuchs in the equation. But it is useful information. It's just complementary to the main, very delicate information that people like Hall and particularly Fuchs have access to. So anyway, as we continue on, now, this used to be a shorter talk until my friend John Earl Haynes had to go and find another spy a few years ago. So Dan, you can blame John if he's here. I don't know if John's here or not, but he is here. I saw a hand back there. I consider John Earl Haynes, who's in the room with us tonight, and his partner Harvey Clare, who I believe is at Emory University in Atlanta, these are the real scholars on this subject. Okay, this is something that I do as part of my job. John and Harvey have been looking at this for years and years. So if you're thinking, well, what's the scholarly treatment? Who are the guys that are really going through the FBI records, documenting all of this, that have spent careers doing it? John and Harvey. And by the way, Claire is K-L-E-H-R, if you'd like to look up their work. Back in 2019, I think it's fair to say, and John will correct me if I'm wrong, that as they were doing some research with some FBI records, they kind of inadvertently came across another spy at Los Alamos. So I highly recommend the article that is on Oscar Sabor, who's our fourth spy today. You can find that online for free. It's in the journal Studies in Intelligence, and you can find out all kinds of things about the discovery of Oscar Sabor by the FBI. I'm going to run through his story very quickly. Now, Sabor was born in, oh dear. So, you know what I'm seeing is that if the security people, remember, we're trying to keep insider threats out. If we don't let New Yorkers in, we get rid of 75% of the problem. Just something to keep in mind. Sorry to my friends from New York. Again, I know there's many of you here tonight, so a lovely place, that New York. But anyway, we've got another young guy from New York City. It's interesting to consider if David Greenglass and Oscar Sabor themselves or their brothers may have come in contact at some point. I believe that John and Harvey have traced Oscar Sabor, at least his brother Stuart, back to the city university there, where I think Greenglass had some connections as well. One thing that you might be wondering is, did these guys know each other? There's no evidence that I know of that they did. They were all operating in somewhat of a vacuum, again, based on the knowledge that I have right now. But anyway, Sabor is also in the Special Engineer Detachment because he's done some coursework in electrical engineering at Ohio State University. He goes to Oak Ridge first, spends several months there. He arrives at Los Alamos toward the end of the year, and he is a private first class in the group X2C, which becomes X5 a little bit later. Now, a nuclear weapon is not just an idea. A nuclear weapon is like a million ideas that have to work together perfectly. Okay? And so anyway, one of the big problems that they were having were the development of detonators. Remember, you've got a lot of high explosive in an imploding bomb. How do you set that off? Well, you have to develop a detonator. Let's go down to the hardware store and get some. And it didn't work that way. And so we had to develop those. What about the circuit for firing the detonator? We had to develop that at Los Alamos as well. And this was a real problem, to develop the detonator with the detonator circuit and to get them to work together seamlessly. It was almost a crisis. And so Sabor, with his electrical engineering work, arrives, we think, to kind of help with that. As he gets there at the tail end of 1944, that crisis has kind of been abated. We've kind of figured it out. So where can we put this guy? He ends up going through several different organizations at the laboratory. One of the things, we were gearing up for the Trinity test. Okay, so the Trinity test is about to be conducted in July. Trinity was heavily diagnosed, and over a year of planning went into the Trinity test. We'd better get somebody there to help set up the experiments. So he's a part of Trinity. In fact, we did a rehearsal test for Trinity on May 7th, 1945, called the 100-ton test, because we blew up 100 tons of TNT that was laced with radioactive materials to find out what would happen. By the way, if you're planning to do a nuclear weapons test, you might want to practice, especially if one had never been conducted. That's what the 100-ton test is. They want to properly calibrate their instruments. They also want to see how much radioactive material might be thrown up into the atmosphere. Okay, so he is a part of that. There is also very strong evidence to suggest he witnessed Trinity. The main control bunker Trinity was 10,000 yards south of Ground Zero. Oppenheimer was there. The countdown for Trinity was conducted there. Several luminaries were there. And also there were different stations in the Trinity bunker. One of those stations included the station for the geophones. They measured Earth shock as part of Trinity. We have a cutaway graph of the Trinity bunker that is divided and shows all the stations. The geophone station was almost right behind where they did the countdown. And guess who is specifically mentioned as the geophone technician? Oscar Sabor. So it is likely that Oscar Sabor was within earshot of the countdown for Trinity and probably just within feet of Dr. Oppenheimer as well, okay? And so anyway, after, as you can see on the screen, if you can read that, John, so that is part of a letter that I've quoted on there for Ken Bainbridge. Ken Bainbridge was the test director, and John Manley, who's mentioned there, is a group leader. Bainbridge says, Manley and I would greatly appreciate having Sabor return to Manley's group on or before June 15, as he will be extremely valuable to Manley. Isn't it interesting that the test director and a group leader at Los Alamos are kind of fighting with another group leader on Oscar Sabor? He was highly thought of by the evidence that we have been able to piece together. He had a couple of pretty rapid promotions at Los Alamos as well. He did ask to be a part of the destination group. These are the scientists and technicians on Tinian who are going to prepare the weapons for them to go into combat. He made rosters for that, except for the last few. So we don't think he was actually on the destination group. We found no evidence he went overseas, but apparently he at least almost did. He was a part of Z Division after the end of the war. Z Division was stationed down at Kirtland. They turned into Sandia National Laboratory, so Sandia started out as a Los Alamos wartime division. They're in charge of kind of the assembly of these weapons and the weaponization of them. So if you put all these pieces together, although Oscar Sabor is not a senior scientist, he's very young, but he's seen a lot of different pieces of the lab. Now, when you take Sabor's pieces of the laboratory, and Greenglass's pieces, and Hall's pieces, and Fuchs, you put these together, and you've got a pretty clear view of what a nuclear weapon looks like. So again, Fuchs, I would argue, because of his senior status, his understanding, all the work that he had, his complete access basically to everything, was probably the single most valuable and devastating spy. But together, I think that these spies really provided the Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin with a clear view of how to build a nuclear weapon, okay? So anyway, I'll quickly mention this because we are unbelievably almost out of time, at least to me. Maybe you're bored, right? But anyway, has anybody heard of Perseus before? For a long time, for many years after the Cold War came to an end, there was an alleged fourth spy, at the time, fourth spy, that was codenamed Perseus. Now, we are now very confident, and I know that you can't read the quote there from John and Harvey. This is part of their scholarship. But in short, there was no Perseus. Perseus was a disinformation campaign, I believe, largely created to protect Ted Hall, who, in the early 90s, had not yet been discovered as a spy. Let me read that quote for you. So anyway, from John and Harvey. But with the opening of the Venona decryptions, now Venona was the secret project that enabled us to break Soviet codes. That was one of the greatest secrets of the Soviet, or I should say of the Cold War, that we could read their mail. But with the opening of the Venona decryptions in 1995, it became clear that Perseus was a Soviet-Russian intelligence disinformation operation to protect Theodore Hall, Ted Hall, the real Malad, then still alive but not publicly exposed as a Soviet spy. The fake Perseus Malad was given characteristics that did not fit Hall. There was no Perseus. Okay? And so anyway, I'm grateful for that bit of scholarship. Now I want to talk a moment about, you know, the legacy of our atomic spies today. We're going to fast forward to after World War II. All right? So anyway, the Soviet Union secretly tests its first nuclear weapon August 29th, 1949. Now, has anybody watched these parades that they used to have through Red Square with all these missiles and soldiers and tanks and things like that, right? So Stalin now has an atomic bomb. Don't you think that he'd have a big parade and celebrate? I would. Well, maybe not, because the Soviets were smart. They realized that the moment that they revealed to the world that they had nuclear weapons, the arms race would start. And the United States already had 4 years, almost to the day, almost a 4-year lead. The Soviets want to keep this secret and try to get caught up as much as they can. Anyway, the West, the United States, we discovered that the Soviet Union has nuclear weapons very quickly after that. Now, espionage, I think, was an important ingredient to the success of the Soviet nuclear weapons program at that point in time. But I don't want to downplay the Soviet program. There were a lot of really, really talented scientists in the Soviet program. But I do think that it's remarkable that the Soviets were able to build nuclear weapons that quickly for this reason alone, among others. During World War II, the United States lost a little over 300 Americans killed in combat every day of the war, on average. The Soviet Union lost 15 to 20,000 people killed as a result of military action every day for years. Think about that for a minute. 15 to 20,000 people killed every day on average. And that number does not include casualties, people who were injured during the war. Much of European Russia, essentially all of it, had been destroyed. Yet the Soviets were able to build nuclear weapons within only 4 years after the United States. Really a remarkable challenge, espionage aside. Now, as we go through this, I think that the scholars who have looked at this, well, how much time did it save the Soviets? Because the Soviets would have been able to do this completely independently at some point. And I think that most scholars who have examined this estimate between 18, 24 months, something like that, a year and a half, maybe 2 years of time. Now, that may not seem like much, but during the Cold War in 49, 50, 51, what's going on during that time? These are some of the tensest moments of the Cold War. China's become communist. We've discovered, as you're about to see, atomic spies amongst us. The Korean War has started. I mean, it was a really tense time, and we're going to talk about that actually on the next slide. But as I want to mention again on this one, you can see Yuli Khariton, who is on the stamp, one of the early, very prominent Soviet scientists. After the Cold War came to an end, he wrote, "The whole Soviet people should be deeply grateful to Klaus Fuchs for the vast amount of information that he provided the Soviet Union." Now, that's pretty significant praise coming from Khariton. I think that Fuchs was singled out in particular because at that point in time, he was the known spy. Now, Ted Hall had not been discovered, certainly Oscar Sabor had not been discovered, and David Greenglass, again, his information in a vacuum is relatively not as important. But anyway, one of the most senior scientists in the Soviet Union himself said, you know, this was a great contribution, basically, that was made by Klaus Fuchs. You can see that is a picture of the first Soviet atomic bomb, Joe 1, RDS 1, First Lightning, take your pick, lots of code names for it. So very quickly, why does it matter? And I think that this is where, you know, again, you know my perspective. I'm an American. I get paid by the lab. This is my view of it. You might have a different one. But anyway, I frown upon this kind of espionage. You know, Joseph Stalin was one of history's greatest mass murderers. It's estimated that he killed between 3 and 20 million of his own people. There's a really long rap sheet on Stalin in particular, why we generally don't like him in the West. Now, the Russians have a different view of history, but the Russians are not paying me this evening, as it turns out. So you might want to ask me about that during Q&A, because it is an interesting perspective and understandable, I think, even though we may disagree with parts of it. You know, Hitler helped, or I should say Stalin helped Hitler start the war. He protected Hitler's flank while Hitler invaded all of the countries of Central and Western Europe. And so you can see, well, maybe you can't see, but Stalin, when we talk about being paranoid of the Soviet Union during the Cold War, I think that paranoia was based on a lot of actual history. You can see on the map up there, the Soviet Union forcefully annexed half of Poland. They invaded Finland. They took about 20% of Romania, annexed forcefully Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. Right, this was an expansionistic, pretty violent state. And so to give them nuclear weapons information, to give Joseph Stalin that type of information, I don't think that was a great idea myself. Maybe you feel a little bit different. We will close this out in just a few minutes, and I'll talk you through kind of what happened to the spies next, and we will talk very briefly about some of their motivations there. But anyway, also that 18 to 24 months-ish for helping the Soviet program along also prematurely accelerated, or really brought into existence the arms race. The United States nuclear stockpile of the late 40s was almost non-existent. You see very, very low numbers of nuclear weapons in those years. Well, by the year that Stalin died, we had about 1,200 nuclear weapons in the stockpile formally, and that number is going to increase exponentially in the years ahead, as is the Soviet nuclear weapons stockpile as well. So anyway, going back to those common threads very quickly, there are some similarities between Hall, Fuchs, Greenglass, Sabor, but not really that many. when you think about it. 3 of them were very young soldiers. They were also from New York City. But as I mentioned before, nice place at New York City, fan of, fan of New York. I don't think that we want to kick out New Yorkers. We would be losing a lot of talent if we did, right? My New Yorker, yes, yes. So we don't want to do that. 2 of them did have several things in common. You can see that Sabor and Greenglass, I have to wonder if they knew each other, were X-division. They were in the same division, nearly in the same group. They were the same rank. Who knows what may have happened between them. But anyway, I think some of the more interesting common threads here are that, each of these spies, at least in my opinion, was more zealous for the cause than they were knowledgeable of the actual authoritarianism that was being done under Stalin in the Soviet Union. Okay? I think some of them continued to be in denial for quite a while about that, which leads to the next bullet. But the other thing is, again, there's no coercion here. Nobody's being bribed or anything. Nobody's being enticed. All believed in the ideology, again, to one degree or another. But for the most part, these are real true believers in Soviet-style socialism, okay? But maybe the thing that will keep you up tonight, because, right, you're American security people, you're concerned with the inside threat, are any of these guys dangling from the ceiling? Now, we have lots of fences and barbed wire. We have our own guys with submachine guns. We're kind of set up to stop Tom Cruise. Bring it on, Tom Cruise. You're not getting in. But we're not really concerned about Tom Cruise. The real threat comes from within. And in this case, the thing that they all 4 have in common is that they were given clearances and they were entrusted with secret information that they promised to protect. Okay, so anyway, what happened to these guys? 3 minutes, we'll see about that. Yeah, I got the look. You don't even have to give me the high sign. I'm going to go through it as fast as I can. But who wants to know what happened to them? Yeah, they want their money's worth, except for the few that left in disgust there. But anyway, so this is Ted Hall. So anyway, after the war, Hall completes his PhD in physics, and then he decides, you know what? I don't know about physics. I think I'll get a PhD in biology instead. Yeah, I know. I mean, I'm like flunking Algebra 2 as a senior in high school. I'll be a biologist. What a guy. So anyway, he does that. He does get married. Can you imagine that conversation with his wife? Honey, there's something I need to tell you. I guess it probably wasn't much of a conversation. She too was a true believer and believed in what he was doing. They end up having 3 daughters. He eventually immigrates to the United Kingdom and does do some pretty impressive work in the biological sciences as well. He was well, I don't know if that's the right way. Let me take that back. So anyway, remember those pesky Venona, the program code, the code breaking I told you about, that you know about because of John Earl Haynes and his work at the Library of Congress. So anyway, we can read the Soviets' mail, and we know he's guilty, in part because his nickname was the Youngster. It didn't take a whole lot. We knew he was guilty, but here's the problem. To prove that somebody's guilty of something, the way it's supposed to work in our country is you have to prove it in open court. So here's a guy who's now a biologist. He's not even an active threat anymore. He's out of the program. He's brought in for interrogation. Because if we prove he's guilty in court, we have to give away the biggest secret of the Cold War, that we can break Soviet codes. So we want to crack him under pressure and get him to tell us that he was a spy and give us the name of one of the people that he's working with. He does not crack under interrogation. Neither does his handler, Seville Sachs, and I believe that his code name was Star, if I remember again. John will make a long list of corrections for everyone there. Neither of them cracks under pressure, and he walks. So nobody knows in the public that Ted Hall is guilty of espionage. The FBI does. He lives for many, many years after that. Now, in 1996, the public becomes aware of the Venona decryptions, and it doesn't take a lot to figure out that Ted Hall was Malad. So he is questioned. He essentially, kind of, sort of admits that he was Malad. And so if I'm his attorney in the room, here's the statement, as I believe he was talking to a couple of reporters from the New York Times. Again, I will be corrected, I'm sure, if I've got that wrong. He said, I was indeed mistaken about some things, in particular my view of the nature of the Soviet state. The world has moved on a lot since then, and certainly so have I. So if I'm his attorney, I'm sitting there going, but I guess he didn't have an attorney there, because he continues to say, but in essence, from my perspective of my 71 years, I still think that brash youth had the right end of the stick. I'm no longer that person, but I am by no means ashamed of him. That was his view. He died of cancer November 1st, 1999. So, Dr. Oblivious, again, my nicknames, is that fair to have that like in a serious scholarly historical talk? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. You can complain to the organization, right? But anyway, Fuchs, remember, he's a British citizen, so he goes back to the United Kingdom. Now, Fuchs is still in their program. He's still active in the British nuclear weapons program. He's still stealing information. And guess what? Venona, we know that he's Charles. So he's a British citizen, though. That's a little bit different. So Fuchs is interrogated as well, and he cracks under pressure. And he says, okay, I'm guilty, gives a full, very detailed confession that you can read and kind of trace his steps that he took down here in Santa Fe. And also he gives them the name of his courier, Harry Gold, who would come and pick up information, take it off, eventually to the Soviet Union. So anyway, Fuchs, I imagine, was thinking, do I get to live? Well, Klaus, you're a British citizen. The maximum penalty for committing espionage, well, not committing espionage, the maximum penalty for sharing sensitive information with a friendly country, because the Brits had never been at war with the Soviet Union, although they kind of came close in 1939, the maximum penalty is 14 years in prison. You get the maximum penalty anyway. And so he is apparently a pretty good prisoner, and he stays in jail for 9.5 years, and then immediately immigrates to East Germany. His communist sweetheart, who had fled from Germany to the Soviet Union, has come back. They get married, and they live happily ever after. As a big shot, Klaus Fuchs is a big shot of a laboratory, not totally unlike Los Alamos, for many years, and he dies a couple of years before the Berlin Wall comes down. Now, you're probably wondering about this oblivious business. This is a quote from Klaus Fuchs. He says, "It was always my intention." Now, he said this to Rudolf Peierls. Peierls, his mentor, his father figure, could not believe that he was guilty, goes to see him in prison, and he says, "It was always my intention, when I had helped the Soviets take everything over, to get up and tell them what is wrong with their system." Yeah, can you imagine? Yeah, I've got an appointment with Stalin this morning. He's running a little bit late. We've got some things to review. Yeah, so there's that. And also a quote from a physicist who worked with one of our physicists, Rolf Lanzhoff. He said, "I have never before known a person who possesses such a marvelous ability to think in abstract terms, who is at the same time so helpless when it comes to either observe or evaluate reality." So that's Dr. Oblivious. There's more too, but not tonight, because we are kind of getting very close to the end. I am a couple of minutes over. We get to David Greenglass, where the talk used to end. Right, well, anyway, Greenglass is arrested. Now, he's an American. And if you're an American, yeah, you'd better confess and give us the name of one of your helpers, or you're going to die in the electric chair. Who thinks David's going to die in the electric chair? And how did they get his name? Well, remember Harry Gold? Harry Gold doesn't want to die in the electric chair. I'm guilty, talk to David Greenglass. Can I go to jail for a decade instead? So David Greenglass takes that as well. He says, okay, yes, I am guilty. I admit it. You should talk to my brother-in-law. Talk to Julius. And you know what? Let's make a 2-for-1 deal. Talk to my sister, too. But you can't prosecute my wife, who knew about this, too. And I don't want to go to jail all that long. And so anyway, there's a lot more to this story, as you all know. There's questions. People have questioned, should people have gone to the electric chair? Was Ethel guilty? All these other things. We don't have time tonight. We are going to finish in just a minute, because we only have one more quick slide after this. But anyway, the dominoes have fallen all the way to the Rosenbergs. The Rosenbergs never admit guilt, and they both die in the electric chair, one after the other. I believe that Ethel died first, and then Julius died quickly after that again. Hopefully I've got that right for you tonight. Meanwhile, though, Ruth Greenglass, David's wife, is never prosecuted. He spends about not quite a decade in prison. He's released. He changes his name and lives until 2014. Many, many years. In fact, that's when the first iteration of this talk came out. Can you read the quote up there? He was interviewed, remember, 1996 is kind of the year that everybody finds out about the Spies. It's back in the limelight because of the Venona work that John and his colleagues did. So anyway, during one interview, David Greenglass said, "As a spy who turned his family in, I don't care. I sleep very well. I would not sacrifice my wife and my children for my sister. I seldom use that word, sister, anymore. I've just wiped it out of my mind." What a guy. And again, this is real. This is like a real spy story. These things happened. We get to our final slide tonight, which will greatly please our friend Daniel. Daniel, thank you for your patience. We got extra minutes. We're grateful to our host. So anyway, you can see John R. Haynes standing up there on the right, receiving an award from the CIA. I believe it was the CIA. Thumbs up, thumbs down, something like that. Thumbs up, there we go. For the incredible work that he and Harvey had done to unmask Oscar Sabor as the fourth spy at Los Alamos. So anyway, after the war, and this is where you can really, we talked about kind of what Sabor did at Los Alamos, and me and my colleague, Ellen McGee, she was going to be here tonight, but it's a sellout. So thank yourselves, except for Ellen not getting in. But anyway, we're trying to finish an article on the work there. But we wouldn't even know about Oscar Sabor if it were not for John and Harvey. But the FBI knew. The FBI knew that Oscar Sabor was a spy. That's where you can read the article by John and Harvey that is in Studies in Intelligence. Well, anyway, he was all but certainly a spy. I think some of the evidence that was collected were illegal recordings, probably obtained without a warrant. But now, all these decades later, we know that Sabor committed espionage. In fact, he quietly and gradually immigrated to the Soviet Union in the early 1950s, okay? By the time the FBI finds out about him, he's long gone. So the question at this point is, well, what did he know? What might he have shared? And so the FBI sends a letter to the Atomic Energy Commission. You have any record of anybody named Oscar Sabor? So we took a shot in the dark in our archive, the National Security Research at Los Alamos, and let's put Sabor in the database and see if anything comes up. And it did. Norris Bradbury was our second director. He was the director from 1945 until 1970. And his son's in the room tonight also. I don't know if he wants notoriety, so I won't pick him out, but a good friend to me in our program. Anyway, the FBI sends a letter to Norris Bradbury. What do you know about Oscar Sabor? So Norris Bradbury knew this story many, many decades ago. We didn't know about it until John and Harvey told us about it. Anyway, having immigrated along with his brother, their wives, and I believe that it was his brother's mother-in-law, as I recall, they go to the UK, they go to Israel, ultimately they go to the Soviet Union and live the rest of their life there. Oscar Sabor lived until 2015. When he died in Moscow just a few years ago. And so again, the real heroes of telling us this true story, my friends John R. Haynes and Harvey Clare, I'm so grateful for them and their help. That is the talk for tonight. So not too bad. All right, let's. So Dan, do we want to take a question, or how do we? I mean, there's so many of you. I'm outnumbered, so I guess that it'll be like what, Family Feud. So whoever buzzes in first.
Just repeat the question.
Okay, I'll do that. Yes. So there's our question. First question. So the question was there ever an agreement with the Soviet Union to share atomic research? The answer is no, but. Has anybody here heard of the joint verification experiment before? You get bonus points. Okay, now those of you who raised your hands, I'm going to quiz you on it. So I hope you're right. So yes, so toward the end of the Cold War, because our relationship with the Soviet Union had improved greatly, we allowed Soviet scientists to go to the Nevada test site where we did most of our nuclear testing and measure one of our devices, measure one of the yields of our devices during a test. And they allowed our scientists to go to Semipalatinsk, one of their test areas, and measure one of theirs. I cannot tell you how mind-blowing that must have been at the time, to see Soviet scientists in the holiest of holies measuring one of our devices, and for us to get to do the same. So anyway, the joint verification experiment, there's lots of stories about this. In fact, a very quick one, if you'd like to know more out there, because this was such an incredible event, I would say in Cold War history, the laboratory decided to make a documentary about it. And the documentary is called, and it won't be a surprise to you, remember the 80s? Trust but Verify. Yeah. And guess who hosts this laboratory documentary? Charlton Heston. Yeah. Charlton Heston made a series of movies, some of them born classified, for free for the laboratory. He said, all I want is for you not to pay me, because you may have saved my life. Before Charlton Heston was famous, he was a B-25 bomber's gunner in the Pacific theater of World War II. He thought he was going to go to Japan and die. The war ended. He came home, and he became famous and rich. And so when the lab reached out to him, he said, I'd be happy to help you. He did accept a piece of trinitite from us. So trinitite is the melted desert sand created by the Trinity test. He gave it to his son and said, son, this is your real birthstone. If this didn't exist, me and you, we might not either. And so anyway, you can find Charlton Heston hosting Trust But Verify on my personal YouTube page. I mention that because I do not make money off of it. But if you look for Alan B. Carr Historian YouTube, I've got about 60 videos posted, including the Charlton Heston movies, of the collaboration. That may be a strong word, but the partnership that we had between ourselves and the Soviets. Wonderful documentary, check it out, and I hope that kind of answers the question there a little bit. But no formal exchange of classified information, just informal exchanges, unfortunately. Let's see, so I see another one up here, and then, okay, unfortunately, this is the last one out here, but I am sticking around for a little while at least. I hear an Arby's beef sandwich waiting for me with my name on it on the way home. But anyway, I'll stick around. What is your question?
Well, why did the Russians make these spies with kind of like pointing an arrow at the spy?
I think that's a great question, and I'm not sure. Now, John back there, yes, so the question was, why did they give these guys code names that were kind of hints as who they were? And I don't know. And again, I don't know if John wants to unmask himself tonight to answer that. It's a great question, but yeah, I would come up with something that totally threw the enemy off myself. That was quick. Can we take another one? One more. Dan's going to be generous. Dan comes through again, right? Thank you. I'm sorry I don't have an answer for that. So there's the next one that I saw. Yes. Right. That is correct. What's the next question? No. I don't know if they'd want us to say that. I don't know an awful lot about that. Again, that might be something for John and Harvey and the work that they've done and others. And so, again, because of the scholarship of others, I get to give you this talk tonight. And so I'm grateful for all of them and my colleagues at the National Security Research Center over at Los Alamos. I hope you enjoyed the talk, and I hope that we can do it again.